Let's go to the next slide. So I'm Amy Miracle. I'm a research scientist in the Alcohol Research Group at the Public Health Institute. I co-lead the I-STARR project with Dr. Carmen Masson, who's a professor of psychiatry in the School of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. The project also includes co-investigators Sarah Zemore and Lenny Jason, biostatisticians Meena Subbaraman and Libo Lee, and communication specialists Diane Schmidt and Dustin Kebzu, and our project coordinator is Quinoja Capitani. Next slide, please. So the I-STARR project activities are guided by a 17-member advisory board comprised of a diverse group of leaders from across the country. Most advisory board members wear many different hats, but as a whole, they represent recovery and recovery housing leaders, treatment providers and payers, national policy advocates, as well as researchers and educators. So some of our advisory board members may be in our audience, but also many of our advisory board members have or will serve as presenters in this webinar series. Next slide, please. So before I introduce the presenter for today's webinar, we'd like to do some polling to get just a sense of kind of who's here at the webinar and to get a kind of a pulse in the room. So as you see on this slide, there are 4 questions in today's poll. One just kind of getting at who you are, one getting at how proficient you think that recovery housing is to be supporting people on MAT or MOUD, and to get a sense of capabilities as well. So why don't we launch the poll now? And this should show up on your screen. Because there are 4 questions, you may have to scroll through using that gray bar so that you can answer each of these questions. And Zoom actually won't let you submit the poll until you've answered all 4 of the questions. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to look through the polling questions and select your responses. Dustin, can we go to the next slide? And when we get a nice critical mass of about 75 to 80% of the respondents or the participants in the webinar responding to the poll questions, we'll pull up the results. People are being very thoughtful and responses in their responses to these polling questions. And here are the results. It looks like the largest percent of folks that we have in the audience today are recovery residence operators or owners or staff members. So this is, you're in the right place. In terms of what people were thinking about with respect to the percent of residences that are proficient, so the majority are saying less than 25%. The next question, on the scale of 1 to 9, how would you rate yourself as being able to support someone's recovery? So the largest group of respondents is actually in the 7 to 9 range. And then the next question, on a scale from 1 to 9, how would you rate yourself at being able to support someone who is using any medication that has potential for misuse? We do have more of a range here, and the largest percent is still in the 7 to 9 range. So I think this is really good. I mean, I think that we've pitched this webinar well. We have a good audience here. We also have a range of folks in terms of proficiency, so we should be able to hopefully learn from one another throughout this webinar. So why don't we go to the next slide? Without further ado, I want to introduce today's presenter, Jason Howell, who I've known and worked with for over a decade. He is definitely someone who's on my speed dial for information about recovery, anything and everything. So Jason is a person in long-term recovery from mental health and substance use issues. He has an MBA from Texas A&M University and is a recovery support peer specialist and supervisor. Jason is the executive director of Recovery People, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that engages, educates, and empowers change makers to use their lived experience to help others affected by substance use and related mental health challenges. He is the founder, and the former board president of the National Alliance for Recovery Residences, and he also is a national speaker and has co-authored several peer-reviewed journal articles. And with that introduction, I want to hand things off to Jason. And if we go to the next slide, he will be presenting an overview of MAT Proficient Recovery Housing. So Jason, feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much, Amy. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about recovery residences that are proficient at supporting persons on medication-assisted treatment. And I'm excited to see the number of individuals that we have today. Looking at the chat, we have individuals really from all over the place. I really appreciate that diversity. And I also appreciate people participating in the polls. It gives me a sense of who's in the room today. So if speaking of the chat, if you would like to enter things in the chat as I go along, I will try to look over and see if we can have a bit of a dialogue, but also know that we're going to have time at the end of this for some questions. And so you're welcome to enter your questions as we go along, and we'll catch those. So with that, if we could move to the next slide. So the older that I get, the more that I found value in really having a historical context. It really helps ground me and gives me an understanding of my current situations and how to move forward. And with that in mind, I ran across this particular quote that I thought was very poignant for today's discussion. It was made by Lynn Legier. She is a woman in recovery, and her quote is, "Whereas the story of mental health from a systems perspective has been one of oppression, the story of substance use has been one of neglect." And what I take away from this is really over the last 2 centuries, thinking about how our system has treated individuals like myself with mental health and substance use issues. We've either been locked away, and that can be in sanitariums or in prisons, or we've been neglected, and that could be a lack of funding or just kind of making believe that we didn't exist and that we didn't need access to services with parity to other chronic illnesses. But one thing about this oppression and neglect is how it has had folks step up in the recovery community. If you could go to the next slide, please. Out of this need, we have really seen social entrepreneurship. It has been individuals and family members in recovery that have really developed the types of support services that we need to help each other on recovery. And in my mind, just like I took my substance use challenges and turned that into the beautiful gift of recovery, so too as the recovery community really use social entrepreneurship to promote recovery. So for me, this is all reflective of recovery and baked in. And so if we could go to the next slide. This is especially true with recovery housing. I don't know how many of y'all have read William White's book, Slaying the Dragon, The History of Addiction Treatment and Recovery in America. There's 2 versions. I own both versions, and I've read it cover to cover several times and keep it close to my desk for reference points. And if we use that as a resource and look at recovery housing and where recovery housing originated, we can go back as far as the Washingtonians. This is in the temperance movement. In the 1800s, the Washingtonians were a mutual aid group that were providing peer support to one another. They understood the need for safe and sober housing It started out as a room in a meeting hall, and then from there evolved into what today we know as recovery housing. Thanks, Amy, for dropping that into the chat. A century later, we move into the 1900s, and more of you are probably familiar with Alcoholics Anonymous. And as we saw the emergence of AA, we saw the emergence of AA homes and also what they called AA retreats and AA farms. And if we could get into a time machine and go back to that period of time, we would recognize those programs as recovery housing. So that brings us to today, and we have to ask ourselves the question, who amongst us is stepping up and being the social entrepreneurs and creating the recovery housing for the 21st century? We're not creating recovery housing for individuals that lived, a century ago. We need to be thinking about how do we create recovery housing for the environment that we're currently in. Next slide. So to that, what's going on in our current environment, you've likely seen these graphs, but I think that we should visit them again today. The first one on the left, the one with the blue bars, that is the number of overdose deaths per year, starting in 1999 up through 2021. And you can clearly see that there's been an increase in overdose deaths here in the United States. And then we have to ask ourselves, so what is driving those overdose deaths? And that's where figure 2, the chart on the right, comes into play. You can see the various different lines represent different substances, and there's one line in particular that rises higher and faster than the others. And that is synthetic opiates other than methadone, and this is primarily fentanyl. So if we're creating recovery housing for today's population, we really need to think about the substance fentanyl, how addictive it is, and how potentially deadly it can be. And so with that, could we move to the next slide? So 21st century recovery housing really needs to think about being proficient at supporting persons taking medications to address their opiate use disorder. You heard Amy at the beginning of the hour talk about these different terms: medication-assisted treatment. These are FDA-approved medications for substance use disorder. It's a broader umbrella, if you will. There are medications for things other than opiate use disorder. So that's why we start seeing the use of the word MOUD, or medications for opiate use disorder. And the FDA has approved 3 different kinds. There's your agonist, your full agonist, and an example of that is going to be methadone. You've got your partial agonist. An example of that is going to be Suboxone. And then you've got your antagonist, and an example of that is going to be Vivitrol. They're different medications. One can't easily be substituted for another. Really, the decision of taking one medication over the other has to be made between the individual and their doctor, the prescriber. It shouldn't be made with the house manager. The house manager has no business, making that decision. So if we can move to the next slide, please. I've been, using this word proficiency. And so what am I talking about when we say MAT, proficient recovery housing? And in my mind, we're talking about recovery homes that are both, 1, willing, and 2, capable of supporting persons undergoing medication-assisted treatment for their opiate use disorder. And that's one of the reasons why we asked that polling question at the top of the presentation. And I wrote it down. There were 43% of y'all who thought that less than 25% of the recovery housing capacity out there we're really going to be proficient at supporting persons on MAT. I tend to agree with you. And anecdotally, we know there's clearly not enough proficient recovery homes out there to meet the need. And so I suspect that's the reason why we have so many people on this call today, is because instinctually, and agree that that is true. Next slide, please. So I mentioned, for me, proficiency has two dimensions. The first dimension is willingness, and the second dimension is the capability. So first, let's take a look at willingness. And if we look to the dictionary, willingness is defined as being inclined or favorably disposed, prompt to act or respond, or my favorite there is accepted by choice without reluctance. And if we think about plotting, before you go to the next slide, let's stay on that one for a little bit. When we think about willingness, we can plot that on a spectrum. And that's why we've drawn this, this vertical line where at the top you have very willing, and all the way at the bottom you have very unwilling. So let's think about your recovery home or recovery homes in general and where we would plot them on that particular line. And it gets complicated, doesn't it? Because there's so many individuals in so many different roles within recovery housing that can shape the willingness. First, we can think about the policymakers as I've entered here. We're talking about the administrators, the owner-operators, the individuals that really control the governance, creating the policies and procedures, or empowered to change the policies and procedures. But just because you have the policymakers in a recovery home that are willing to support persons on medication-assisted treatment doesn't mean that the direct support leadership is. And when I say direct support leadership, who I'm talking about is the residents. If y'all are familiar with recovery housing, they're all founded on social model. It's really the residents and that culture, the senior residents, that are driving so much of the goodness, the secret sauce within recovery housing. Larger recovery homes may have employees or have contractors, or maybe using volunteers to come in and provide recovery support. Each one of those roles and types of individuals can really shape the willingness, and everybody might not be on the same page or in the same place with regards to willingness of supporting persons on MAT. But I wanted to break all this down because as we think about moving a recovery home or the industry towards willingness, we need to understand this complexity and how we can engage all of these different players in the conversation. Okay, with that, let's move to the next slide. And here is that other dimension that I use when I talk about proficiency, and this is capability. This is the ability or having the qualities necessary to do it. And by it, I mean supporting individuals on medication-assisted treatment. Again, it's complicated. If we look at this spectrum, and here we have the horizontal line with very capable on the left-hand side and all the way on the other side. I'm sorry, I flipped that. On the left, it's very uncapable, and to the right, very capable. We have to think about where is a particular recovery home on that continuum. And again, there are various players to think about when it comes to capability. Do we have the policies and procedures and mechanisms in place? And do we have the staff, the senior residents that can implement those different policies and procedures and protocols? Okay, with that, let's go to the next slide. This brings us to a quadrant. And in this particular quadrant graphic, where we would like to see recovery homes go from a proficiency standpoint is that top right-hand quadrant, both willing and capable. And as I will agree with you all, earlier you said only about 25% of the total capacity is at that place. So strategically, we need to look at where are other people, on this chart. If we go in a clockwise formation, we go to the bottom right hand, and those are recovery homes that are unwilling but capable. And so if you find your recovery home in that quadrant, then it's really going to be looking at how do we change the willingness, how do we look at our culture, and be able to plot a strategic plan in order to move to that top right-hand quadrant. Again, moving in a clockwise fashion, we have unwilling and incapable. And I'm afraid that these recovery homes, it's going to be a really heavy lift to get to their goal. It's going to take some time and a lot of intentionality. And then quickly we can go further into a clockwise manner to that top left hand. These are recovery homes that are willing and incapable. And, I used to be very cynical about this group. I called them, you got the money, I got the bed, recovery homes. And I don't, although there might be some recovery homes like that in this particular quadrant, I think that it's much more diverse than that. I think that there are recovery homes that definitely have the willingness, but they don't have the capability, the right policies and procedures. They just don't know how to support individuals on MAT. And I have a lot of hope that we can help them figure out what those policies and procedures should be so that we can get them to a place where they can support individuals. All right, with that, let's move to the next slide. So I will definitely triple highlight this. Just like we cannot force someone to recovery, we cannot force a recovery home to be proficient at supporting persons on medication-assisted treatment. And I bring that up. We've long been telling some of our government partners and our funding partners who their mechanism is normally to pass a law or put a funding restriction that forces individuals to accept persons on MAT. And early on, several of us were saying, whoa, I don't think that's what you want to do. It's not going to get you the results that you want. And that first study in the left-hand column, the study that was published in 2018, really bore that out. And so to look at that, the researchers looked at recovery residences. Earlier, I mentioned the social model and how important the culture of the home is. And in the homes that they were studying, they identified that the residents themselves had a negative attitude towards medication-assisted treatment. And so when persons on MAT moved into the home, assimilated into that culture, surprise, surprise, they discontinued their medication-assisted treatment. The policymakers were really upset about that. The funders were like, no, we didn't want that to happen. And those of us that work in recovery housing understand that that's part of the magic of recovery homes, is it's individuals moving into a culture of recovery and adapting that culture. So of course, if the culture didn't have a positive attitude, there was going to be discontinuation of the medications. But the second study, the bullet point underneath that, is what really gives me hope and I think really shines a light to the future. So again, a similar study was done. The difference is this time when they measured the attitude of the residents, looking at the culture within the home, that culture was accepting of persons on MAT. So as individuals on MAT moved into the house, and again, these were houses that had a mixture of persons on MAT and those that weren't, the recovery outcomes across all the residents were positive. So I think that shows that we can do this. We can develop recovery homes that are proficient at supporting persons on MAT, and they can receive the benefits of that recovery housing provides. Next slide, please. So again, if you're developing that strategic plan of how does my recovery home become more proficient? I don't know if you ever get to that place. I think it's like cultural competency. It's a goal that you always strive to and that you mindfully move towards. And if you're moving towards proficiency, then you really need to do a good inventory. Really kind of look at what are the barriers? And for me, the historic barrier, the issue that really has contributed to the willingness and the capacity capability barriers has been that historically recovery homes have not had individuals on medication, specifically persons on MAT, medications for opiate use disorder. And so there's not this historical context. Recovery homes are oftentimes using, metaphorically, mom's recipe or dad's recipe, and creating the culture and setting up the policies and procedures. And because we don't have that historical reference and resources, we need to draw upon the social entrepreneurship part of the recovery community and look at, how do we increase willingness and capability. That brings me to the next set of bullet points. When we're looking at the willingness barriers, medication-assisted treatment has long been associated with harm reduction. And so when we start introducing what is categorized or seen as harm reduction concepts into recovery housing, there becomes some philosophical tension. I know that some individuals really have started blending harm reduction and recovery. I'm not sure if that is helpful. From my perspective, I see harm reduction as a very important approach in philosophy, and recovery as a separate yet important and a different philosophy, and that the two can really coordinate with one another, really kind of depending on where that individual's at in their stages of change. So you can see this philosophical tension, which contributes to the cultural differences, which contributes to that level of willingness. And there's part of the cultural belief system is the sense of, how are we defining abstinence in a recovery home, or even recovery in a recovery home? And so I encourage you to start looking in this areas as you look to shaping your culture of your recovery homes to make them more willing to accept persons on MAT. And I think that we also need to acknowledge that just because someone is on MAT doesn't mean that they have a goal aligned with recovery, much less with that particular recovery home. And I think it's okay to name that. But the important thing is there are a lot of individuals on MAT that do have recovery goals, and their recovery goals aligned with recovery homes. So the last bullet point, looking at capability barriers, recovery housing is supported largely by the culture in the home, which we've talked about several times here. And so if you don't have the culture right, then it influences the capability of supporting individuals in recovery. I think it's also important for us to name that some medications have diversion risk, and several of the medications for opiate use disorder do, but they also have therapeutic value. And so we need to be thinking about what are the policies and procedures that we use to mitigate that diversion risk. But some of those policies and procedures require staffing that not all recovery housing might have. So again, lots of different things to think about as we want to move a recovery home towards proficiency. All right, could you move to the next slide, please? Also things that I want to mention that could help us in that direction is the concept of abstinence, and defining abstinence in a way of, if somebody is taking their medication as prescribed, that aligns with abstinence. That is something that the National Alliance for Recovery Residents has elevated and invited people to embrace. That's also something that SAMHSA has published and invited people to embrace, and I would ask you to do the same. Next slide, please. I talked a little bit about, harm reduction and abstinence-based recovery and how there's been some tension around that. And the National Alliance for Recovery Residents offered up this particular Venn diagram that showed the overlap of using, say, medication-assisted treatment that some people really link to harm reduction, and recovery housing, which has been rooted in absence-based. And where do we see, the synergy? Where do we see the overlap? And that's where we come up with this bridge concept, medication-assisted recovery. And if we could move to the next slide. For me, medication-assisted recovery, it's more than medication-assisted treatment, with the treatment putting the emphasis on the treatment part. Or I tend to use MAR over even medication used for MOUD, because again, that puts so much emphasis on the medication. And in this case, the medication is important, but not the full meal deal. For me, it's a three-legged stool where individuals are taking their medication as prescribed by their doctor, as well as receiving recovery support. In this context, we're talking about recovery housing, as well as getting cognitive behavioral therapy. Next slide. So I think the other thing that we've been asking folks to do is balance this need to take action and support individuals that are caught up in the opiate epidemic. We definitely need to be taking action, but at the same time, as like some of the research that I've pointed out, we just can't automatically say, all right, we're going to put MAT in recovery homes, and MAT is evidence-based, recovery housing's evidence-based, but if we just put the two together, we can't assume that's evidence-based. We really need to be doing the research and being really mindful around this so that we can come up with evidence-based practices for MAT proficient recovery housing. There's lots of different folks that are doing this work. I'll elevate one that I'm most familiar with. I actually see some of the recovery housing providers in this meeting today that are participating in this, and it's called Project Homes. Next slide. So a little description about Project Homes. It provides medication-assisted recovery housing at no cost to residents in Texas. It's a collaboration between the University UT Health Science Center in Houston and local community partners. It's funded through the Texas Health and Human Services using the state opiate response dollars. UT Health serves as the fiscal agent and conducts research, and they're comparing three groups. They're comparing individuals on MAT that are not in recovery housing versus persons on MAT that are living in level 3 recovery residences. And then the third group, they're living in a level 3 recovery residences, plus getting recovery coaching from a local recovery community center or external recovery coaching. These houses are currently located in Houston, Austin, San Angelo, Midland, and El Paso. So if y'all are familiar with I-10 that goes from east to west and west to east in Texas, these homes are kind of around the I-10 area. And the NAR affiliate, which is Trone in Texas, accredits and provides annual fidelity checks. And then Recovery People, my organizations, provides training and technical assistance towards medication-assisted recovery proficiency, which we're talking about today. Next slide. So this research is ongoing, and so please keep your eye out for the final results. But some early takeaways, the researchers have been interviewing both residents and house managers, and here's some of the takeaways that they found thus far. Structure promotes personal growth. And for those of us that work in recovery housing, we're cheering because we know that's been true for all residents. Providing the structure really helps. And that's true for persons that are under a medication-assisted treatment. Staff as resource brokers. I think that they're finding this is it's always important. If you look at the NAR standards, it's something that's highlighted in the NAR standards. I think that it is even more important in these homes because it's about connecting individuals to MAT-friendly resources. It's important to have clear boundaries, that the recovery roles are not bleeding into clinical roles or medical roles. residents with dual diagnosis, many individuals with an opiate use disorder also have a mental health disorder, and they're highlighting that they find it valuable to be living with other people in dual recovery. And they're also highlighting the value of living with other people on MAT that are pursuing recovery. Prior, they felt very isolated taking MAT, and now they're part of a recovery community. So for me, this is very exciting because all these things apply to individuals that are not on MAT, and we're seeing the value of recovery housing for persons on MAT. And with that, I think that brings me to my last slide, and I will pass it over to Amy.
Jason, that was fabulous. So we've tried to cover as much as we could within the context of an hour-long webinar, but there's a great deal that can be said on the topic of MAT proficient recovery housing. So to make sure that folks have access to information about this topic, we pulled together a list of resources where you can learn more. Next slide, please. So this slide contains information on journal articles, as well as other resources where you can learn more about the topics covered today. I will actually, we dropped them into the chat already. That's fabulous. We also throughout the presentation and just now, so you can access those that are publicly available. But I also want to add that Jason will be back for the next 3 webinars to take a deeper dive into a lot of things that he was only able to briefly cover today. So why don't we go to the next slide? Because this is where we would open up things to you all who are attending this webinar for your questions for Jason, or any comments or thoughts that you have on this topic. So feel free to unmute yourself and chime in, raise your hand within Zoom, or just drop a note in the chat. So Anne, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And I apologize, I had to join a little late for some meeting overlap. I'm Ann Shields with the Fletcher Group. Just a couple of things. Many of you have been asking me, I mentioned in the chat that we actually have policies and procedures. I have been distributing these in Word documents because everybody needs to tailor it to their own staffing, where they want to assign responsibility, etc. I'm happy to share those with you, Amy, and share them out. That's what they're there for. They may be more involved than some houses need, but they'll get you started with whatever level of staffing you have. Also, what I've been using in working with homes over the last 2 years, and I call myself the Sublocade cheerleader at Fletcher Group, just so you know. I've seen that the advent of the fentanyl era has really changed attitudes. People have seen too many of their clients and residents and friends die exposed to fentanyl. So, and with the need for medication, really almost a different order of medication than we used 8 years ago to keep people safe, there's been a great deal more acceptance and willingness to learn. And we've been using sort of a healthcare quality improvement approach to help people educate their staff, bring their boards along, et cetera, et cetera. But I realized fentanyl was such a game changer when I was visiting a home in Kentucky, which was clearly not very friendly to MAT. And then one of the staff folks told me, well, I spend the weekend distributing fentanyl strips, test strips. I ran into that duality in a lot of places where folks really were aware of the changing issues with the drug epidemic and the need to bring things along. So anyway, that's all. I just wanted to say thank you. This is glad to see this webinar and happy to help in any way I can.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anne. So we got a comment in the chat from Gant Galloway to everyone. I'd like to point out what a big difference Suboxone and buprenorphine and methadone make in OUD, on the order of 100 or 75% reduction in death rate, and comparable improvements in a variety of other dimensions. So thank you for that, Gant. And I see a lot of thumbs up and some hearts for that comment as well. Other questions? Again, feel free to raise your hand. And if for whatever reason I don't see your hand raised, feel free to jump in.
This is Anne again, and then I'll stop, I promise. But I'm just so excited to hear all this great discussion. One of the other game changers, if you're trying to work with a MAT, not proficient, concerned house, a lot of their concerns might be around where those adequate control of medications. So injectable buprenorphine, the Sublocade and the other new formulation of injectable buprenorphine, they're wonderful. They take that concern away. So really, I've been pressing local federally qualified health centers to expand their pharmacy to include injectables. And that has helped a lot. So that would just be something for y'all to think about. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Other questions for Jason? Anything that he presented, because we have him back for other webinars, that you might want to have him expand upon more? If he can't address it fully within the context of this webinar, maybe bring it up in a later webinar.
I do see one in the chat. Alexander asked, do you believe it would be beneficial to have a separate organization facility for harm reduction homes in order to help alleviate the tension amongst recovery homes? So I think there's a lot in there. I think harm reduction homes, when I hear that word, I'm thinking about housing first. So that's a different model than recovery homes. I'm not sure in that question whether you're talking about recovery homes that accept MAT and whether we should have recovery homes specific for persons on MAT and those that are not. Globally, I do know organizations like City Central Concern up in the Northwestern area that have the entire continuum of care. They have housing first, permanent supportive housing, as well as recovery homes, and they do it really, really well. There are separate dwellings and they have different staff. So it can be done under one organization. When I think about recovery homes that are specific for MAT versus just all recovery homes, accepting a person on MAT, I come of a mind of an and both. I think that there's an opportunity for all of our recovery homes to be accepting of persons on medication, but there are individuals on MAT that the research is starting to pan out. They really like living in a home that's very proficient and really focused in on supporting individuals on medication. That could be an MAT or maybe some other psychiatric medications of concern. I just think that we need all of it.
Yeah, that's a great response, Jason. And I think that I'm going to transition here. This has been a really great discussion. We did get another question in the chat about MAT specific recovery housing in Florida. So if there are folks in the audience who want to drop some information in, that would be fabulous. I want to go to the next slide to just give people a sense of kind of where we're headed with the I-STARR project in the next couple of months. So we have another webinar later this month. So there's a webinar series for providers. There's also a webinar series for folks who are wanting to conduct research on recovery housing. So in December, later this month, we'll have a researcher webinar on the pros and cons of mixed methods designs. In January, we'll have another couple of webinars, one that is specific to recovery residence operators and providers, and that there's actually a typo in that slide, unfortunately. So that's going to be Jason again for the provider webinar, and he's going to be talking about recovery housing and screening applicants for applicants who are prescribed medications of concern. And the researcher webinar in January is going to be on a mechanisms of action in recovery housing and measurement of key constructs. And that's going to be a fantastic webinar. It's going to feature Doug Polson, Lenny Jason, and David Best. So stay tuned for our webinar series. The webinars for the researchers are always the first Tuesday of the month. They're from 11 to 12 if you're on the West Coast, and do the time zone math for wherever you may be watching or zooming in from. The researcher webinars are always the third Tuesday of the month in that same time slot. Before we leave this slide, I do want to tell you about some other things that are coming down the pipeline. In addition to doing this training series and these webinars, we also do some other things with the I-STARR project to support the research infrastructure for recovery housing and recovery housing that is MOUD supportive. And one of those things is supporting or providing funding for pilot studies. And we're really lucky to have on this call today one of our pilot study awardees, Dr. Rachel Winograd, and she's going to talk about her pilot study, which is being run out of the University of Missouri at St. Louis. So Rachel, if you're there, feel free to unmute yourself and talk about the I-STARR project.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Jason, thank you so much for this really on the nose presentation. What I'm going to talk about dovetails really nicely with what you talked about. So here at the University of Missouri St. Louis, we're grateful to have gotten one of the initial I-STARR pilot awards. So this means we have a 1-year grant to do a study. And what we're trying to do is develop a measure of exactly what Jason was talking about, barriers to MAT and recovery housing, both from an attitudinal or willingness, as he put it, angle, and as from a capacity angle. So far, we've worked closely with some subject matter experts who run recovery houses and live in recovery houses, and we've done some focus groups to really hone what these items look like and make sure the wording makes sense. And we're going to launch in a week or two as soon as we get some final approvals. And we would love your support in spreading this far and wide, especially those of you, the 43% or whatever of recovery housing operators on this call. I'm talking to you. So we would love for you to fill out this survey and then share it with your residents. You'll get paid a $15 Amazon gift card. It should be relatively easy, take no more than 15 or 20 minutes. And the goal here is for us to really get a nuanced understanding of exactly how these barriers show up in houses. And then for us to do a lot with the information we get from this, share it back with you all. You know, this is something as a tool, if we develop a measure that actually works and it makes sense and recovery housing operators across the country can fill it out, it can be used, for example, within a recovery house agency that has 5 houses. You know, the owner can administer the survey to all 5 house managers and get a sense of where each house is at in terms of their MAT barriers. Or a state can implement it, a NAR affiliate in a state could implement it to all the houses in the state, or a recovery coalition, you know, and it could also be used. My big hope is for advocacy and funding to get more support for recovery homes who want to be supportive of MAT, especially houses in that quadrant who are willing but incapable. Maybe we can advocate for some funding specifically to fund some capabilities, some capacity building for those homes. And then for those that have capacities but are unwilling, it'll give us more nuanced information about why they're unwilling. What exactly is it that they bristle at? And the last thing that I think is exciting about this measure is for a solid subset of the questions, we're going to really differentiate between naltrexone, buprenorphine, and methadone. Too many of these MAT studies lump them all together, but we know that people feel very differently about each one, so we have to ask about them separately. So keep an eye out. We're going to send this hopefully you'll get it, from a few different angles. My goal is for you to be a little bit annoyed come February. But hopefully, if you get 3 or 4 emails about this study, maybe one of them will strike you on a day when you actually have 15 minutes to do it. So again, my name's Rachel from Missouri. Thank you in advance for your support and sharing the survey with your friends.
So Rachel, just to be clear, folks should be looking in their emails for something from you about the I-STARR project.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Is there any other way that people can find out about how to take the survey if they're interested?
Oh,
Is
funny
there
you
a
should
link
ask.
that you could drop in?
Yeah, we made our own little email. So first let me put in my email and then let me go copy it. We're still a baby little study, so we don't have a whole website or anything like that.
Yep. And while Rachel's dropping
okay.
that in, I will just take a little time to, she's modest, to Rachel's horn, that I really like the approach that she took to developing this survey. So it's a survey, it's to test and measure. She's creating a tool that people can use to assess capability and willingness from the provider perspective, but also the perspective of residents. So there are 2 different versions. She, had feedback and solicited purposely feedback from both operators and residents about the kinds of questions she was including in this measure. So we're really excited about it. We think it's going to be very useful, but we do need folks to use the measure, complete the survey so that we can validate it and we can have some evidence behind it.
Thanks, Amy. I always forget to talk about one aspect of this study whenever I have this opportunity. So thanks
Excellent.
for
Well, we've got your
filling in the
details.
gaps. Yes. Please
Okay,
reach out. Thanks for the time.
And Rachel, you may be back in subsequent webinars too. We'll
Oh yeah,
to mildly
you
annoy
get rid of me
people.
for a while. Yeah, you're stuck with me.
Excellent. Okay, why don't we go to the next slide, please? So we're actually near the end of our presentation, but before we sign off, I do want to just remind people that this is part of a training series. Actually 12 webinars comprise this training series, and folks who register and attend all 12 of these webinars can not only receive a certificate and an opportunity to have their name listed on the I-STARR webinar or the website as someone who's completed these webinars, but you can also earn 12 CEU credits. So if you have registered, you will see a little evaluation form come up at the end. Make sure that you fill that out. If you haven't registered, but are thinking about doing it, fill out that survey too. Make sure that you go online and register for the I-STARR training series. We want to make sure that we can support your learning about all things recovery housing in lots of different ways. So all of our webinars that have already happened, this is the 7th in our series, are available to view online, but to provide people with a more interactive experience, if you've missed a webinar that has already been presented, or if you want to make sure that we track your attendance in completing the training series, we're also going to be building a learning management system where you can view the webinar, you can have a space to respond and to drop questions for the presenters. We'll be monitoring questions in the learning platform so that you can kind of get more out of your viewing experience if you're just now coming to the webinar series. So there's that. And I already mentioned that next month, Jason Howell will be back again for the webinar series. We hope that we see you. I think that, the webinar series thus far has been more kind of recovery housing basics. And this, at this point, is going to transition to topics that are specific to supporting folks on medications for opioid use disorder in recovery housing. So I want to keep your eyes peeled and your ears open for webinars. You can learn more about the webinar series on the I-STARR website. And also on the I-STARR website, you can sign up for our newsletter. which will not only have information about the webinar series. We in our last newsletter highlighted Dr. Winograd and her pilot study. So it's a nice just opportunity to stay in touch with the I-STARR project and what we may be up to in any particular month. I think that's it, folks. Thank you so much for your attendance today, and we hope that we see you back here at a webinar soon.